Good evening, everyone. As the director of Goethe-Institut Max Müller-I Mumbai, I'm having the great pleasure again of welcoming everyone present here, as well as our virtual audiences, to our fourth literary intervention in the framework of State of Nature. State of Nature, which, as the name suggests, is based on ecology and climate change, ventures in its current third iteration since 2018 into multidisciplinary culture production and its associated conversations. I would like to mention that the related exhibition, New Nature's Eternal Beauty is Born, is on view in our gallery and the Natural History section and lawns of the CSMBS till mid of April. It includes the works of 17 young and senior contemporary artists dealing with ecology from different perspectives. The exhibition is curated by Ravi Agarwal and the literary intervention by our curator of literature, Ranjit Hoskote. Today's lecture, titled Embracing Nature at Scale, Architecture, Urban Design and Planning, is by Rahul Mehrotra. Rahul Mehrotra is a professor of urban design and planning and the John T. Dunlop Professor in Housing and Urbanization at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. He is the founder principal of RMA Architects, which has studios in Mumbai and Boston. Mehrotra published numerous books and articles on city planning, discourses on urbanism, and curated landmark exhibitions on architecture and society. His most recent books are titled Working in Mumbai from 2022 and The Kinetic City and Other Essays from 2021. Since 2014, Mehrotra has been a member of the CICA, the International Committee of Architecture Critics. Dear Rahul, I'm really happy to have you virtually with us tonight. And now I wish all of you an enjoyable and insightful evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bjorn, for that introduction, but also a big thanks to Ravi and Ranjit for inviting me, to participate in this series and to present this lecture. I'm really honored and excited about this. Also the exhibition, I had the good fortune of being in Mumbai and looking at the show, and I must say it's moving, it's wonderful, it's insightful, but also to see the kinds of challenges we face on the planet through the lens of artists actually allow different kinds of extractions in terms of perspectives on how one can look at this. And so I am going to share with you perhaps my perspectives of how we can act as architects or as professionals. And because this is the last talk of the series, I take the issues as a kind of starting point and won't spend time describing the issues, which have been more beautifully articulated than I could ever hope to do. So with that, I'm going to jump into my presentations, which I've titled Embracing Nature at Scale. And really, the way I'm structuring the next 45 minutes or 50 minutes is just touching upon a few issues which I think are helpful when we look at the question of nature and how we might formulate our own actions within this imagination. And then I'm going to jump into 4 projects. I see them all as research projects, but some of them manifest themselves also as buildings or projects or objects, and just share with you this sort of notion of how one can actually embrace nature at scale. So I want to first start with just the idea of the absolute and the transitional, which is, I think, critical because absolutism and absolute thinking, and please, I'm kind of using the lens of an architect and a designer, an urban designer, could say planner, and so my perspectives are coming through that lens. Absolute solutions is unfortunately a way where we privilege or we attempt arrogantly to impose our control on the landscapes that we intervene in. And there is an arrogance inherent in kind of this sort of absolute approach to problem solving or any form of intervention. And so I think the transitional is a much more useful category where we, I believe, can perhaps more sensitively embrace nature, so to speak. And so this sort of idea of the absolute and the transitional is something that's been very important and an important driver, so to speak, of our own work, etc. And so that sort of, to be more precise, that takes us to the notion of end state planning, end state imagination, end state design, versus designing for and imagining for flux, which is really currently the condition that we are in, but it's always been the condition. It's just that we haven't accepted it, and the contingencies of climate change, etc., now begin to bear on us much more vividly, in a sense. And so, really, what I meant by absolute and transitional is, in planning jargon, designing for end state versus flux. End state meaning knowing the solution, knowing the problems, and coming up with a kind of absolute solution. Whereas designing for flux necessarily requires us to think in transitionary terms in the way we engage with design and any form of imagining interventions. And so, of course, with climate change, this sort of extreme ends of flux are becoming more evident within the lifetime of a generation. And here you see how what we can accurately predict might happen to Mumbai. And there's a fundamental difference in the way we then begin to look at how we respond to this condition. And these are just some examples. I'm not going to go into details, but really what this makes us think about is how we have, as designers, dealt with nature. I mean, you can talk about nature also at different scales, all the way from plant material to how watersheds operate on a territory. And we have often, or we have historically, at least in the last century or two, we have, as planners and architects, designed human settlements and then accommodated nature in the interstitial spaces. This approach has to completely reverse radically if one has to embrace nature at these different scales, which is, we have to discern the logic, the patterns, the operations of natural systems, and then accommodate the built interventions in the interstitial spaces. So it's a complete reversal that we'd have to challenge ourselves with if we have to be effective in embracing the questions that we're going to have to deal with. I just use this emblematically, and these are two exact framings of the riverfront in Ahmedabad, which, of course, you know, this is a much more complex project. So, I mean, they are amazing things one can celebrate in what has been built, and the fact something like that was even pulled off. It was a form of patronage, which was perhaps absolute in itself. But what it resulted in is a riverfront development, which I think comes close to what I am describing as an absolute end state solution. And it trains the river in contradiction, perhaps, to its natural impulses in terms of the fluxes that it would otherwise play out on that landscape. And as we know, it's dammed on either end. So is it a river or is it a lake? And what you see on the right is the similar frame, which means it's exactly that zone near Gandhi Ashram, where a student project actually demonstrates to us what might be a transitional solution, where accepting that the river might flow for a few weeks in a high monsoon period, it's designed as a series of holding ponds that might dry and become beautiful amphitheaters or maidans in the way Gandhi used it during the freedom movement, or how textile workers used it to dry textiles. It becomes almost a productive landscape, which becomes part of the city, and in other fluxes becomes part of a water body that contains, you know, the dynamics of the river. But it is a transitionary solution that allows that flux to occur. It's open-ended. It accommodates the changes that might occur with time, and it doesn't sort of embrace through design a kind of absolute approach. And I think emblematically, they are important for us to notice. I'm just trying to illustrate what at least I mean by the absolute versus the transitional when we are dealing with these conditions. The other idea is the notion of time. Planning has not embraced this question adequately, I believe. Landscape architecture is a disciplinary practice, does this automatically, but I don't believe even articulates it adequately. And so therefore the question becomes how for architects, for urban designers, for planners, for landscape architects, we begin to find ways of embedding the notion of time as being intrinsic to our imaginations. And I think that is a critical component in being able to imagine what I'm referring to as transitionary solutions and designing for transitions. And here, I mean, for me, my own sort of work was really around the question of time, began to be informed by the experiences I had in working on the Kumbh Mela, which we called Mapping the Ephemeral Megacity. It was an interdisciplinary project at the university. So therefore, one also learned from the kinds of perspectives the other disciplines brought, all the way from public health to divinity, and helped one understand how in an extreme condition like this of the Kumbh Mela, the notion of time can be understood as an effective and an instrumental tool for planners. And I don't want to go into the details of the Kumbh Mela, but just the fact that with the receding waters, a landscape appears of sand on which a city for 7 million people to accommodate for 55 days emerges. And it all occurs in a period of 6 to 8 weeks. And these are two images taken from the same spot where we were camping when we took this in October, the image on the top. And when we arrived there on the 14th of January, this is what we saw. A very robust city built on a grid, a very robust grid, replicating all the attributes of any existing city. It's 7 million people, so it is a mega city. Anyway, here we found many things which I think began to inform how one could embed time. I, again, don't have the time to go into the details here. But one of the fundamental learnings for me here was that even the governance structure works on a temporal scale, which means the hierarchy shift as you get closer to the operations of the Mela, starting with the chief minister and the state, but those powers shift in terms of decision making. And if one thinks about it, part of the problem in our cities, more than the architecture, which have an overbearing legacy in terms of what one can move or not and extend it into the fabric of the city, it is the governance structures of the cities that often become very redundant and therefore not nimble, and therefore not sensitive to being able to, or even having the capacity to be able to accommodate, respond, imagine transition, imagine flux, and respond to it, right? It becomes really evident with all the the sorts of conditions that now emerge with climate change, flooding, which occurs more periodically, etc. In any case, the question was, how does one expand this into a broader rubric, which would be effective in other ways for planning, or really would infect the debate on planning, which is premised on the notion of the city as a static entity. And so we extended this research into this idea of ephemeral urbanism with a provocation: does permanence matter? And therefore then extended this further into creating a taxonomy of what we called ephemeral landscapes of the ephemeral landscapes. One of transactions, which are markets, which sort of occur again across numerous scales of religion, of strife, of extraction, celebration, refuge, which is refugee camps, military. And in each one of these, the attributes are completely different, as well as the temporal rhythms are completely different, right? Transactions occurs, sometimes in rhythms of weekends every week, sometimes every month, sometimes annually as markets, whereas extraction is a 50-year cycle. A copper mine might run out of its resource. And so the temporal rhythms are completely different. And so it's necessary, therefore, to make this taxonomy and not kind of universalize the rubric of the ephemeral. And of course, we tried mapping what are the time durations, what are the rhythms. It's a work in progress in terms of making it effective. But in any case, all of this challenges the idea of the city as a research project, as a static and stable entity. And then with climate change, I think the ephemeral, the reversible, I think could be potentially very effective tools in shifting this imagination to facilitate more transition, thinking about the transitions, thinking about the design of transitions, etc. So with that, I'm going to now just share with you 4 projects where knowingly and unknowingly, one has explored some of these issues. And I say that because some of this work is current and some of this work is 25 years old, where one was instinctively trying to respond to this. And, it is venues like this, I must say. So, thanks to the organizers, that allows one to bring pieces together to articulate these thoughts. So, I took the idea of scales because I feel the notion of nestling scales and then trying to identify the intersections between these scales, because each scale nourishes, informs, constraints the other scale, is very critical, because it creates, I believe, very productive feedback loops in our own minds to situate what we do even at the level of an object within a broader kind of imagination. And how can one not do that if one is looking at the question of nature, of new natures, of how we inhabit the planet, which is a natural phenomena, I suppose. And so I sort of, for simplicity, really have, I guess one can't not say it's not influenced by Rem Koolhaas's extra large, large, medium, small, but it seems to be a clean category, albeit using it for different reasons. And so in my mind, the extra large is really the planetary, the regional, the national, the state. The large is, watersheds, metropolitan, the city. So I'm highlighting the ones I'll touch upon. A medium is, of course, the neighborhood, and buildings are, what I would imagine is small for now. So the extra large is the national territorial scale. And here, the fundamental question, I'm situating this now in India because to start at the territorial scale on the planetary sort of scale is beyond my my qualification. So I thought I would just start at what is the national scale, but also because it's the research that we are, what we are doing. And, when we even talk about the urban, because this has bearing on the way we imagine our cities, the way we imagine how we respond to and use nature or natural systems really as the organizing or the challenging kind of armature, it becomes really very, very critical. In the same way as I was saying, how we reverse radically this idea that we recognize, discern the logic of nature and what it needs to operate, and then place what is are human interventions in the interstitial spaces, right? There's no, we have to start that question at the national urban policy level almost. And in fact, in India, we could describe the state of India in a kind of incomplete urbanization, which is really characterized by the temporal, the strong ties with the rural, subject to economic swings, and with the poor in the country having no substantial housing, public health, education provisions. And this all results from the flux because there's an uncertainty of location in some ways for a majority of the people. So therefore, one can describe this as a condition of flux, of changing political, social, economic conditions, and as well as the literal movement of a large number of people between urban centers, rural hinterlands, both seasonal agricultural rhythms, as well sometimes more permanent shifts on account of social and economic distress. And so we've been sort of looking at what this means. And the criteria the government uses, as you all know, are these 3 criteria that are up on this slide, which is a population of over 5,000, a density of 400 persons per square kilometer. And And the criteria that over 75% of the male population are in non-agricultural employment. That's a bizarre one, which has a whole historic legacy there. And so you begin to get small and big dots, right? But if you deconstruct this, and we've done this at, based on the last census, albeit, but at the village level, you begin to see incredibly interesting patterns. So if you use the first criteria of a minimum of 5,000 people as the unit to describe something as urban, you get a very pixelated, well-distributed set of settlements within the country. It's very continuously urban in some ways. And if you look at the density question of 400 people per square kilometer, along the coast and in the Indo-Gangetic plain, you get the world's biggest megacity. It's continuously more than 400 people per square kilometer. Greater Houston in America is about 250 people per square kilometer. So it is quite amazing, that density that sits in the Indo-Gangetic plain, which is also the most susceptible in terms of groundwater and all of that, which is another discussion. And if you then take the last criteria of 75% in non-agricultural, then you get a contradiction, because the world's biggest megacity suddenly becomes rural, because everyone there is simultaneously doing agriculture as well as dwelling. And so you begin to get these very contradictory readings. And so it's interesting in terms of what criteria one should apply. Of course, the criteria of 5,000 people per unit is a good one. Some of them are much, much larger, but it tells you that it gives you a minimum a figure on which you can base other forms of infrastructure, all the way from public health to water, education, so social infrastructure, etc. But these two maps are also interesting when you map on the railway system, and you begin to look at rice cropping, wheat cropping, and you begin to start actually anticipating movement of people on a temporal scale, because again, these are seasonal occupations, and we all know this from our lived experiences in India, how people we work with, collaborate with, associate with, employ, move back and forth. And so therefore, what this mapping is doing is trying to embrace many domains that begin to give us these stacks of information that allow us to predict, perhaps, or anticipate or speculate about how we might move around. And this is a really interesting image which shows you that Indo-Gangetic plain, and you just see the topography and the geography, and you realize where people live, how they should live, where they'll be safest in terms of the future. It's interesting that when we otherwise see maps of cities in India, we don't see even the topographical constraints. And looking at a map like this then explains to you the susceptibilities and the densities of the Indo-Gangetic plain, the poverty that's related to it. And what I'm not showing here is a series of maps we've done looking at the state of sanitation. And it's mind-blowing how all of that maps and all the problems land in perhaps the most fragile ecosystem of the Indo-Gangetic plain. And so how does that then inform how we might formulate policies at the urban scale? I mean, I don't have the answer for that, but I think my point is just this, that if we begin to privilege natural systems, resources, and the logic by which these systems operate, we might have to rethink where we create the incentives and the de-incentives for habitation, etc. So, I mean, it's at this scale that I think one has to finally begin. But one of the summaries of the research which is emerging, I hope this will be a book by the end of the year, one keeps hoping, is that while the three criteria mapped together give us about 7,000 or 8,000 settlements that are officially considered to be towns or urban centers, there's something like 14,000 transitioning settlements. And again, I come back to the word transition, because these are not urban by the government's definition, but they're not neither rural by what we might imagine as the definition of the rural, where people are only employed in agriculture, etc. And these are places which are in great proximity to other centers of employment, and it's a whole web of settlements. And maybe that is the unit at which one should imagine interventions. And this is completely off the radar of our official policy, which houses about 200 million people. And so, I think this sort of research and questions then begin to surface other kinds of conditions and situations that perhaps otherwise we are missing. So if we move to the next scale, I want to kind of share with you something we had done over 25 years ago. And this was a project which was called Goa 2100, which was a project that was situated in 2000. It was an invited competition where they invited one architect from one urban designer architect from 7 different countries. And I had the fortune of being invited from India. And we put a team together, and this was a highly collaborative project. Sanjay Prakash, Delhi-based architect, Aroma Ravi, who now heads the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, Rahul Gore, Kapil Gupta, and several others. We formed a consortium to imagine how that was the project, the competition, how we could take a settlement and make it transition over 100 years into carbon neutral, sustainable was the word they used, sustainable cities. And so it was a 2-year competition, quite a mind-blowing process, but it took us a year to find a site. We started with Mumbai and we just thought it was a complete disaster. We finally took Goa only because Goa is one of the few places or the few political kind of entities, a state, let's say, where the watershed definition, that's the watershed boundary, and the political boundary kind of overlaps adequately. And so we felt that is giving us a condition that we should be otherwise aspiring for, even in the way states are formulated, correct? So it was ideal in some ways, or close to ideal. So we took Goa. And really it was the project about how one makes these transitions. So this is the night lights that you see in the way, using that as a proxy, because when we did this in 2000, we didn't even have access to Google Images and data like that. So we just used the proxy of night lights to discern what was the settlement. And what you see in these graphs are how transitions can be made, green and blue can be increased, how built environments can be sort of reduced over time, because we had the luxury of 100 years, which is the life cycle of building. So if you could have disincentives which would allow people to even abandon built areas and move. So it was an early imagination before we even knew the word managed retreat. How would you actually manage retreat over 100 years? And so that was the end result. And you see between these two graphs, the idea was that you would have a change of composition where you see blue-green built environments having smaller footprints in a sense. So it was really about, and we were doing this instinctively, which now I'm articulating, I hope more clearly, which is how one discerns natural systems, how they operate, and then places built environment, the built sort of fabric in the interstitial spaces. And of course, this is where time becomes critical, right? There's a temporal dimension, because we had 100 years as the frame they wanted us to work with, which was the given by the organizers of the competition. It allowed us to imagine transitions, which otherwise with shorter term or without consideration of time leads clearly to very myopic decisions, which are not very productive. And of course, this was a complicated project. It talked about domains that of how these transitions would be made. We tried to look at how this could also be an approach that would resonate with the entire western coast of India using those parameters. You couldn't universalize this nationally. We were looking at governance and how you would decentralize it, because those modules were critical in terms of making the transitions. We looked at livelihoods and how those could shift and what that might mean in terms of facilitating it down to the unit and making self-sufficiency even within the unit of the house, within what we were calling a rice-eating culture, because their water becomes a very critical parameter in terms of how one imagines it. And of course, energy transitions, which were much more complex. And there were many people. We had a team of about 25, and I don't even have the expertise to explain some of this, but it was a truly collaborative project. But it exposed us to understanding the interconnectedness between these different domains if we had to think in these sort of transitionary terms. Mobility was another one. Urban form was very critical, realizing that ground and one-story building with a large Mangalore tile roof has the ability per per unit or per person to collect much more water, to harness much more solar energy than does a high rise, where within the same footprint, you have 200 families. So it was about making a shift also in terms of imagining urban form and new imaginations of articulating what a city might feel like. And then here kind of coming up with propositions of densities of, again, as you can see from the form of this, of how the built environment or the built intervention is put in the interstitial spaces. It's the one that becomes reflexive in terms of adaptation, and not the other way around, where draconic impositions of urban form then have to leave nature to become reflexive and compromise its own systems within the built environment. And then how this sits on topographies, what it might feel like as urban form. I mean, these are urban design sort of propositions. So that was a very important introduction for me 25 years ago, and it's taken me 25 years to really process some of that. And of course, like I said, it was highly collaborative with many other people contributing to it. The next scale is, let's say, the neighborhood scale, where I'm taking a project which is a housing project. It's a low-cost housing project. So it is the formulation of a neighborhood, and this one is for mahouts and elephants. So it becomes also the consideration of multiple species in the process of imagining this, which begins to challenge us to embrace nature in completely different ways. Elephants who were taken and were served the function of actually servicing tourists, and they shouldn't be in Rajasthan and Jaipur. That's an image from the New York Times advertising tourism, and this idea you could live like a Maharaja for a day, I suppose. But what the elephants get reduced to is taking tourists up the ramparts of Amber Fort. It was a competition. The site we got was a site that had been quarried by sand contractors. Elephants have their faces painted for decoration. This was the housing where they lived. The elephants were on the ground, the mahouts lived above. And it was a disaster because the relationship between a mahout and an elephant is incredibly complex, and proximity is critical. We set the problem as a landscape problem because we said, unless you have water and one can simulate the kind of, a kind of landscape in which elephants thrive. So, in Thailand and Bangkok and, on the perimeters of Bangkok and in other parts of Thailand, Sri Lanka, elephants are very happy, Kerala. But in Rajasthan, it is a complete disaster in some ways. And so how could one actually make operational leverage systems that would make it more habitable? So here, in a sense, privileging another species above human beings, and naturally riding on that, human beings would only benefit that much more. So water became the central protagonist in terms of imagining design here, but also situating this, and this is a Google image which shows you the outskirts of Jaipur. Amber is the rectangle in red, and this was the site we built on, but also situating this within this idea of what I was describing, the middle scale, also the idea of transitioning settlements. Now, how does one in these transitioning settlements actually create a condition of self-sufficiency to the extent possible, so that they don't, as these are emergent urban systems, it might be a generation or two before they even avail of the kinds of infrastructure benefits that bigger towns might have. And so those were the kinds of let me say, self-imposed constraints to situate what we might be imagining within that kind of framework. And so that was a site as we inherited it, or as we were allocated it. It was, and Google image allowed us to see streams of water, which became the basis. And so it became a landscape project where, through a series of micro dams, what we proposed was we could hold the water, create a sense of humidity, albeit for those few weeks or months that you get rain in a place like Jaipur, but really use that as a way to transform the landscape. And so it became a design, and Mohan Rao from Bangalore was our landscape consultant, where we first privileged the landscape. We asked him to set up a whole system of water collection and how that might seep into the landscape to create a landscape which could support a certain level of humidity, but hold the water and create an environment that was more comfortable and slightly cooler. And then the buildings were put in the interstitial spaces in the higher ground that wasn't needed for some of these operations that he planned. And that was the final site plan. As you can see, the architecture kind of receded. And what that resulted in was a transformation between March 2007 and 2017. And of course, this is a long, complex story, a wonderful one, actually, where changing governments abandoned the project that allowed the landscape to heal itself. In this case, the water to accumulate, species to emerge, all local. At that point, we hadn't planted. And then when the government comes back to power that had initiated the project, you begin to get another kind of layer of green. And you see this, the hills that you see in the background are the same two kind of hillocks that you see here. So you see the kind of transformation that occurs. But it wasn't about not paying attention to architecture. It was also about disaggregating space. The row house is the paradigm, which you see as a diagram on the top there, which is what was stipulated by the government. But we challenged that and created clusters with open space interspersed within it. So it does a few things. It expands the house spatially because open to sky spaces are as productive and useful in our climate, but it also gives them a shared large space. So if these three families got together, who are otherwise allocated as low-income families only 200 square feet of space as part of the budget to build, they suddenly have a very large courtyard which they can avail of. If they don't get on well, then they retreat into their courtyards and homes, but this can even be a plot for production, etc. And so it becomes a mansion if the three families get on well together. But it also allows trees, it allows nature in a way to be embraced at the scale of the house, at the finest pixelation in a sense. And then the elephant is accommodated in proximity to the mahout, which is a very critical kind of need. And then, there are mechanisms for ventilation and insulation by raising the roof above the elephant's shed and using that to store food. You get insulation, but you also get the hot air to escape. And, it's interesting, elephants can't lie on flat ground. And so they need berms, otherwise they can't get up. We learned this while we were doing this. So this is a site visit where we were making mock-ups of rooms for elephants to see how they could maneuver, get up, lie down, etc. So here, alluding to REM cool houses, extra large, large, medium, small, they also come in these sizes. So that's consistent with the titles I'm using for the different sections. But anyway, this is how it sort of built out. You can see the first water bodies. This was all in 2010, I believe, about 10 years ago. And then it sort of evolved as a settlement. Here you see the proximity of the children to the elephants, but yet not compromising their safety. It changes sort of life for those families, quite poor otherwise, largely Muslim too, and so therefore quite marginalized within the kind of political landscape of the state. And this is what happens to the clusters when people get on well. They begin to cultivate lawns because now they have more water than the middle class in Jaipur who have to buy tankers of water. They have a surplus of water. They grow flowers which they sell. It's a transforming landscape. So here, even the poorest, it becomes a way that really, by privileging nature in this case, the poorest, there's a shift in the kind of equity equation because the poorest have access to amenities of another kind, which even the middle class or the rich in Jaipur have to struggle to acquire. And of course, life corrodes architecture, especially in housing. And here the courtyards become kitchens, so the kitchen can become an extra room for the family. And as life inhabits it, it evolves. These are images I might have taken 10 years ago. It probably has evolved more since the goats have arrived. You can see the neem trees flourishing in the courtyard, and the elephant has bags of food stocked there. And that's a kind of before and after image, which gives you a sense in 10 years what that transformation of the site was. And then when the dish antennas appear and the trees blossom, life is there to stay. there were many unintended sort of things that occurred, and this was one of them, which is that we didn't realize that, of course, the water was, we were clear why we wanted a lot of water. This is an image at the peak of summer where the water has gone down to its lowest level. But this act of bathing with the elephant is very important for the bonding between the mahout and the elephant. And we didn't realize that that was an unintended consequence. I suppose the mahouts gave us that as a feedback. And so even in summer, when otherwise they would have had no access to water, they keep cool and they at least have some access to water. And then of course it's kikar and local species, it's sort of changing. The other unintended consequence was we realized that elephants, the mahouts told us, were very social and they needed to hang out with their buddies for a few hours every day. And so there was no budget. So from some of the leftover steel pipes, etc., we made these pavilions, 6 of them, I believe, and this is just thatch on the top, where they could be tied together so they could hang out and, socialize in a sense. But we didn't realize that the teenage kids of the mahouts were very savvy and they saw this as an opportunity for their economy. And they started a site called Elephantastic, where they put up a charge. If you came to feed the elephant, you would have to pay them 100 rupees. And if you wanted to bathe with the elephant, you paid them 500 rupees or some such number. And they set up a whole thing around the fact that these pavilions had the elephants come together. It is also a complex project because politically, as I mentioned, it made us understand what the role of the architect was, because when you have changing political kind of patronage and you have agencies of implementation that change every few months, ranging from the Umber Development Authority to the Forest Department to tourism, etc., and then you have the mahouts and elephants. We as architects, I think in reflection and retrospect, really played a very important role of bridges in a way, as I would define that civil society does, which is it has the capacity to negotiate between more powerful forces, but has empathy for the grassroots. And we felt very much in a role like that, of trying to get the aspirations of the chief minister and the ministers and the bureaucrats and the elephants and the mahouts all on the same page, on the same table, at least, to exchange those aspirations. And so this was what made it very complex and therefore extended and expanded over a temporal scale that one would have never imagined. And this is just a mapping of those changes, the letters that were written, the lobbying that one had to do on behalf of different constituent groups, including the elephants implicitly. And so this sort of intersection was, I think, at least for me personally, incredibly educative, because the project evolved. It was built partly, it was abandoned, the water collected, trees grew. We came back when the political alignments came together, and it evolved really very, very slowly. So here you see in the last iteration, they actually created more expanded areas for the elephants with chain link for creepers to grow, the pavilions with water where they could hang out with their buddies. But you see it in a much more mature landscape now. And of course, it was also an infrastructure project in terms of how one could use these natural resources there, the stone that was available, to modulate the landscape to make it more amenable for everyone concerned. What was also interesting as an unintended consequence, we planted about 5,000 or 10,000 trees over the 10 years. And what was remarkable is, when I visited after a big gap, I thought that, like those beautiful houses in Shekhawati, there would be paintings of elephants and the decoration, the emblem of the decoration, because we knew once the Rajasthani mahouts took over the houses and would allocate the houses, they would decorate them. So the houses were really basic shells with the kind of openness that they could be appropriated and decorated and transformed, etc. They weren't seen as static pieces of architecture. But we were surprised that what they were painting were birds, because the trees and the water had suddenly made it a very interesting bird sanctuary, and it was attracting tourists who were coming there to see birds, which was incredibly interesting. And in reflection, one sort of thinks about this, because really what we landed up doing by default, and I say that in all honesty, is we emphasize the notion that we should create an armature, a system that would allow life to thrive. And of course, as a result, many forms of life thrive. We were focused very much on the mahots and the elephants, but clearly the birds and perhaps multiple species have now arrived. And this is an image of one of the lowest parts of the site where water accumulates naturally, and therefore it has this kind of density of foliage. And this is a Photoshop rendering, which was one of the aspirations. We've not achieved it in this form yet. It's now the new government has abandoned the project, so it just depends on who's in power. But this kind of creating a landscape of humidity, of wetness, which then allows forms of life to thrive, was really the aspiration. I'll end with the last one, which is the building scale. This was a challenge of another kind, where we were asked to build a building for a corporate office for an infrastructure company, and an infrastructure company that was doing highways and things, and they were in Cyberabad in Hyderabad, which is where every building there is a glass box. And we were perturbed by what we saw as this landscape. And we began to question how we might operate. This is the control room. They're a high-tech company. I began to see these nets in Hyderabad where with the Telangana and Andhra Pradesh rift, there were riots. And this is again now 15 years ago. And so people were building these horrible, dumb glass boxes, but then putting fishing nets to protect the glass from being smashed by rioters. And so we thought this was interesting because these incredibly powerful tyrannical images of global architecture, so to speak, I use that very broadly, was so kind of counterproductive in a sense. So we came up with a building which was a 5-story facade of gardens, but a performative facade. It wasn't a facade where you stick green on the facade, but it was a screen using the old Cuss principle of humidifying the facade and letting hot air go through that humid surface. And so this was a 5-floor high garden. And then every facade was designed with different species depending on the direction it faced, the amount of sun exposure, etc., which we tried out in a nursery in Matunga in Mumbai before we transplanted some of this to Hyderabad, but species that we knew that would grow in Hyderabad, but also to make an aesthetic and beauty and kind of bring beauty to the facade in a sense, with flowers that might bloom at different times, etc. And also a dynamic facade. So when you visited it at different seasons, it was kind of different. And this was handcrafted as a trellis using recycled material. So it was quite inexpensive, which created this armature on which the green could grow. It grows out of hydroponic trays, so it's very effective in terms of water, but it also has a misting system in the facade that humidifies the facade in a way that it allows it to keep cool. And here you see light misting in this image. It's very light misting that really keeps the air humid around the building and situated on a podium. It also has the logic of a series of atrium courtyards within the building that extract the hot air from within. This is when it's in bloom, the different flowers, the lemongrass on the podium. And then the sectional kind of quality of it is about mobility, about privacy, but also about extraction of air. I won't go into this, but we've been trying to now map what effect it has. And we never got a LEED certificate because I think there's a kind of hegemony there in the green industry that has sort of emerged to control these parameters of attributing, what metrics you meet, etc., is ridiculous. So that little terrible building there got a LEED certificate, which is across the road from us, and we never did because we didn't meet the kind of requirements they have, which is another conversation. But it also adds a sense of ornament through the shadow. And it allows, in this case, and for us, this was very important, again, an unintended consequence, but something that we have celebrated and learned from, which is what I call creating a soft threshold. The gardeners here, the 20 gardeners who are the lowest paid in the corporation, actually have the greatest dignity in this condition because the facade, the identity of the building depends on the way they cultivate the green facade, but they roam free in the building, which means they can make eye contact with their bosses at any level. Someone can put a blind down, that very rarely happens. And so there's this kind of empathy that sort of emerges from the proximity that the production of the facade gives access, in a sense, to the lowest page. So they truly are the heroes of this building and of this project. And that kind of coexistence has created wonderful relationships, which we also are exposed to when we go to site, and we are yet in touch with these clients. And so it's very beautiful to see how this dissolution of what would have been a very polarized relationship has also become soft and wonderful. And I think in that kind of empathy begins new relationships. And that's how the building sits in the landscape. There was a public park next to it, which the clients also adopted. And so now you almost feel the building is growing out of that green landscape in the middle of Cyberabad. I'll end with this slide, which is really a mapping colleagues of mine at the urban design department here did, Peter Rowe and Yun, which just shows the oscillation of urban design between outcome-oriented impulses and process-oriented impulses. And so you see how this is sort of shifted around. And I believe this is beginning to flatten now, where we realize that outcomes and processes are equally important. And within a broader ecological awareness, and this is where scale becomes very important, we will flatten this curve, which will make for more productive landscapes, at least as far as I hope our human settlements are concerned. And so it will not be creating the kind of polarized dialogue with nature, but one that I hope we can embrace nature at various scales. So thank you very much.
Hi, Rahul.
Hi.
Thank you. As always, it was a fantastic presentation, and really thank you for taking us through these projects in, as it were, kind of a retrospective mode. You know, this conversation began for us around Hathigao.
Yes.
Partly because in terms of what we've been trying to discuss at State of Nature, why do I have the sense that my voice is reverberating in some Olympian manner? Because what Ravi and I have been preoccupied with is this notion of a multi-species way of thinking about the world, and how we might be able to imagine the planet as a kind of a collaboration among people among species that recognize their mutuality and their tenancy on the planet. But the truth is that it's only one species that has control over these possibilities, because we are a sovereign species. We've misused that sovereignty. And it's up to us to somehow dismantle the effects of this sovereignty and make space for other species across the various domains. And to me, Hathigao really embodies that. I remember when we discussed this previously, it came to my mind that the elephant was the real client. But let me begin with Hathigao. We've gone over this ground before, but I just want to revisit this idea of the role of the architect. You've spoken of how the architect can be a bridge, a negotiator, but in this context also, to what extent were you aware of similar projects or attempts in the larger Rajasthan area, thinking back to as early as the 18th century when Bharatpur was created as a wetland, or work that you know very well, Pradeep Krishn's rewilding projects. I know you've often characterized your work at Hathigao as having emerged somehow in retrospect for you, but Could you talk to us a little bit about this, how it's contextually embedded?
Yeah, no, thanks, Ranjit. That's a good question. And I mean, I think Pradeep Kishan's work, which is currently ongoing, well, this competition happened in 2007, I believe. It was finished by 2005 is six when they started discussing it. So I wasn't aware of that work at that time. Bharatpur one, knew a little bit about, had visited when one was much younger. And of course, one knew how architecture had been used instrumentally, whether it was the lakes and the retreat palaces and the collection of water and all of that. But for us, and it was quite coincidental that before we were invited for this competition, I'd happened to take my children to Sri Lanka. The family went on a trip to Sri Lanka, where one of the last things we did there was go to elephant orphanage in Sri Lanka and looked at it and spent a whole day there. So one had some sort of experience or exposure to how these sort of habitats were, but in a very kind of tropical setting, right? But diving into a project like this, the labyrinth of bureaucracy, the contestations, the politics involved, it was being thrown into kind of the lion's den, in a sense, to use that horrible, description. And so it was all about, just staying afloat in terms of keeping a project going. For me, a turning point was when, we went to site once, and among the public works department, there were all sorts of comments which were derogatory towards the mahouts and towards what they did with the elephants and all of this kind of stuff, that I realized there were many subtexts here and many undercurrents which were social. So that became the opening for us to understand or be sensitized or become empathetic in a completely different way. One was operating in that landscape in a very detached way as a professional from Bombay, sending drawings, someone building, assuming there's a whole ecosystem that's going to, in fairness, deliver a project like this. But to realize that that ecosystem did not exist allowed us, or forced us in a sense, or inspired us, let's say, to begin to engage with trying to even construct and formulate that ecosystem and the equation. So at that point, one started finding ways to reach the chief minister, to meet with the top bureaucrats, to to engage even the public works or whichever agency was in charge into those conversations, and conversations where the mahouts were represented. And it began to open up a different kind of dialogue, which I think facilitated many of the moves we could finally make. So for one, the landscape as an item did not exist in the tender. So even to create the water bodies and things, it meant, finding cracks within the legality of what was possible, and then getting the forest department on board so that they had the budget to plant the trees. It became this sort of, it became a project which was more about then facilitating a way that that ecosystem could work within, versus the kind of sliced agency protocols that otherwise exist. And I think that was fundamental. And so therefore, the role of the architect, in a sense, as I was describing, we understood needed to take on an expanded dimension. It wasn't about an obsession and a fetishizing of the object of architecture, which one, it did everything to make realize, but it was rather to create this armature for life where things could thrive and change. And maybe it's not even the ownership that we, or authorship that we necessarily assume is our own. And so it had to have a different kind of open-mindedness, which was difficult for us. We, I think, attempted to resign from the project 3 times till we began to understand the larger potential and purpose of how one could turn it around.
Which actually brings me to my next question, which is that architecture pedagogy, certainly in India, doesn't really prepare young architects to deal with this range of issues. There's a fairly narrow, still quite iconic kind of emphasis on the building and on, for lack of another term, your architectural genius, which usually ends up at the service of developers. But the amplitude of questions that you raised in terms of addressing caste asymmetry or how to address the natural world and recognize oneself to be a part of it, how are these deficits, do you think, how are they to be addressed within architecture pedagogy?
Well, I mean, I think in my view, there are two aspects of current architectural pedagogy, but I would say even globally, that are critical to address in some ways. One is the notion of the siloing of disciplines. I think the integrity of disciplines is critical, but how those crossovers are made are equally critical. And I think this is a highly problematic condition in terms of architectural education around the world. Now, how one does that is a question. And I mean, there are many ways of doing that in terms of situating the issues, the challenges, the problems. For me, the Kumbh Mela project was interesting, and again, an unintended consequence of setting out on something rather intuitively and passionately, was understanding interdisciplinary work in a completely different way, and realizing how defining the problem and framing the problem is a critical first step to engage a multiplicity of disciplines, right? Where no discipline then becomes comfortable. And I think what we are dealing with, climate change and everything else is throwing up as challenges, is an example of that. So in the case of the Kumbh Mela, there was no discipline that felt they knew how to understand the problem and therefore had to speak to each other. So I think it's important to speak discipline before you speak interdiscipline. But I think the challenge of creating the platforms of that kind of work within even a pedagogical framework is critical. The second is the notion of patronage and who patronizes what. And therefore that leads to the notion of models of practice and what are different modalities by which one practices, and what are, so in current architectural education, it's a patron, an enlightened patron client for whom you do your various somersaults and acrobatics to create, to let your genius emerge, to make the object that can be celebrated. But that is, I think, a very small percentage of what contributes to the built environment. And I think understanding the complexities of forms of patronage, some of which have to be constructed in ways. So if one had to now, with this experience, go back to a project like the Hathigao, one would approach it completely differently in terms of bringing to bear domains that would get patronized, bearing upon whoever the patron is, the state, to construct a framework of patronage within the state that could derive it, etc. So one has learned from that. In the sense, the Goa 2100 project was about identifying the sorts of domains one would need to address. And often in projects like the Hathigao, which are complex, which should have multiple domains, even in terms of the patronage provided, slip in and out. So, for example, the forest department got involved only because that seemed to be the loophole to get a budget for trees, which is ridiculous. They should have been involved right from the beginning, and we would have had a different kind of project, for example, right? So I think it is the role of the architect, and I think pedagogy should prepare us to imagine how we can also contribute to constructing that framework within which projects evolve.
I'm assuming there are questions from our on-site and our online audience, but while they come in, Rahul, I also want to say how fascinated I was by your emphasis on the role of time. Because too often, in a more orthodox way of thinking about architecture, time is seen really under the sign of stress on structures and the decay of materials. So there's a kind of a narrative of mortality that's built into architecture. On the other hand, we're now faced with the scenarios of catastrophe and almost certain sense of an ending. But what I respond strongly to in all these projects is the way you think about duration or time as something that opens out to allow for small redemptive possibilities. I see that very strongly in the building in Hyderabad, for instance, where you use, technical, artisanal devices to tweak and calibrate, say, social asymmetries, for instance. So, did you want to address this the way your sense of duration as a redemptive kind of measure?
Yeah, absolutely, Ranjit. That's well put. And it's only, like I said, it's it's what I've shared with you is work over maybe 25 years, and so you rightly called it a retrospective view on it. And one engaged with many things intuitively, and therefore quite clumsily. One fumbled through it all, but in retrospect, one sees how one could more deliberately and mindfully calibrate some of this. So let me just again go back to the Hathigao project. What was interesting there, and that was the story I didn't touch upon, which is in those 3 images, is when the project was approved by the chief minister, of course, the public works department and agencies that build jumped into it because they wanted to get the buildings off the ground. And of course, it's linked all the way to facilitating kickbacks to having a very tangible set of protocols to make that happen, correct? Whereas there was nothing in there for the landscape, which works on a completely different temporal scale. So that's what I meant if one actually had the experience when one was doing the project, and I would do that now, is to differentiate these domains and then attribute temporal scales to their realization as implementable kinds of projects, right? So which means then you work with completely different temporal scales in terms of what gets finished when, and what starts when, and what should be intervened with at what moment, right? So I think we can take, I think any project, one could break that out more deliberately, calibrated, as you said. So the same thing happened with the Hyderabad project. I've written, as you know, about the architecture of impatient capital. And this is a good example of that, because when we talked about the green facade and hand making the trellis and using recycled aluminum, the clients freaked out. They said that's 18 months more. But we then in the design separated the facade and the whole live facade from the building, and we gave them the building in 12 months and begged them to give us 12 more months to grow the facade, which they agreed. But then that became a design solution where we separated the two, which means the building could be habited and functional without the facade. The facade then added another layer of performance and beauty, let's say, to the building. And so I think it's very useful for us in terms of evolving appropriate solutions to use productively the instrument of the temporal scale.
I'm also thinking of the very strong emphasis in your talk on the possibility of ephemeral urbanism. And just to use your other trope of scale, there's something about the myth of scale and of stability that militates against any of these actually quite robust alternatives. And I keep thinking that suggestions for creative reuse of urban spaces usually get placed under the sign of utopia or eccentricity, whether it's Gordon Marta Clark's Anarchitecture or Yona Friedman's proposals. All this seems to be in the realm of kind of fiction or utopia. How, for instance, would all your findings through your work on the Kumbh Mela, how might that translate into viable urban design?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And Yona Friedman or archigrams, images for the city, etc. So I mean, what I would clarify is that the proposition of the rubric of ephemeral urbanism is merely a provocation to infect the debates about urbanism, which have used architecture singularly as the instrument to organize cities, right? And so it's not a matter of one or the other, but it's how one can use both. And I think as And you well know in the kinetic city, that is the argument with the example of the Maidans and the weddings, for example. So it's a matter of, it's not one or the other. And the early provocations, whether it was Yona Friedman or Archie Graham, they came to be understood as complete alternatives, not as ones in synergy, right? Although Yona spoke about plugging into existing infrastructure, etc. And I think this has been a misunderstanding, which is where I go to the argument I've often used, which is binaries are useful beginnings, but not useful ways to solve problems. And it's the dissolution of those binaries. And I think the ephemeral can be instrumental in that dissolution of binaries and the productive use or effective use of limited space. And so if we do want to embrace nature in the way, at least I seem to be implying in these arguments, then how we minimize our footprint would imply a more effective use of that footprint we attribute to ourselves as one of the species on the planet. And that's where the ephemeral could be an instrumental tool.
Rahul, I mean, this talk of footprint really brings me forcefully back to your marvelous and visionary proposal for Goa all those years ago. And it just strikes me that the reality in Goa has gone completely the other way in this quarter of a century. It's just fallen in line with a truly self-defeating model of urbanism. And this is just a kind of a counterfactual question. If you had to revisit Goa today, what would you? I mean, you and I both have strong and abiding connections with Goa. So, from that point of view, how pessimistic might you be about this?
Actually, I would be very optimistic, and I think if anything, the time is right. If we are willing to be brave enough to look at temporal scales of 100 years and 60 years and 50 years and have the political will to do that, then I think all those ideas which were just beginnings of ideas are very relevant even today, and if anything, more relevant today. I think you allude to the amount that's been built up and investments made. Material life cycles are also limited, and therefore that temporal scale is critical because none of this is going to last forever. And it's a matter of how one creates the transition. So we now call it managed retreat and we call it other things. But I think Goa, what I pointed out at the beginning of the talk, the coincidence of almost accurate mapping of the watershed with the political boundaries you're 75% there just with that one attribute if one has to align politics. In other places on this country, and that's why I showed you that image of the Indo-Gangetic plain, that's fractured in a way that the ones who sit in the Indo-Gangetic plain have no control on what comes there or goes from there, right? So I think this recognition makes me actually not pessimistic about Goa. The political alignment makes you very pessimistic. But if that could be aligned with embracing a temporal scale of 100 years, and there's political will for that over a couple of generations, I think the ideas are yet relevant.
We usually have these slips of paper coming up from our online audiences, either shell-shocked or spellbound. I'm going to go with spellbound.
Or asleep.
No, I'm going with spellbound, like all of us in this room. So, Rahul, thank you so much for sharing these projects with us. And it's been a pleasure over these last 30 and more years to just follow the evolution of your ideas and see them expand in their capaciousness. And I just wish that these manifestos would be, practiced even as they're acclaimed. So,
and not
thank
to,
you.
Not to forget all the contributions you've made to those conversations. So thank you, Ranjit, for that.
Rahul, thank you so much, and thank you everyone on site and online.
Bye. Thanks.